The following outline is provided as an overview of and topical guide to Ecuador. Ecuador, representative democratic republic in South America, bordered by Colombia on the north, by Peru on the east and south, and by the Pacific Ocean to the west. The country also includes the Galápagos Islands in the Pacific, about 965 kilometers west of the mainland. Ecuador straddles the equator, from which it takes its name, and has an area of 256,371 square kilometers. Its capital city is Quito, and its largest city is Guayaquil. General reference. Pronunciation. Kwedr. Common English country name. Ecuador. Official English country name, the Republic of Ecuador. Common endonym. Ecuador. Official endonym, República del Ecuador. Adjectival. Ecuadorian. Demonym. Etymology, name of Ecuador. International rankings of Ecuador. ISO country codes. ECAQ 218. ISO region codes. See ISO 3166-2. EC. Internet country code top-level domain. EC. Geography of Ecuador. Ecuador is an equatorial megadiverse country. Location: Western Hemisphere on the equator, South America. Time zones: Galápagos Islands, Galápagos time. Rest of Ecuador, Ecuador time. Extreme points of Ecuador: high Chimborazo 6,267 meters, farthest point from the center of the earth. Low Pacific Ocean 0 meters. Land boundaries: 2010 kilometers, Peru 1,420 kilometers, Colombia 590 kilometers. Coastline: Pacific Ocean 2,237 kilometers. Population of Ecuador: 13,755,680 people. 65th most populous country. Area of Ecuador: 256,370 square kilometers. 73rd largest country. Atlas of Ecuador. Environment of Ecuador. Climate of Ecuador. Renewable energy in Ecuador. Geology of Ecuador. Earthquakes in Ecuador. National parks of Ecuador. Protected areas of Ecuador. Wildlife of Ecuador. Fauna of Ecuador. Birds of Ecuador. Mammals of Ecuador. Geographic features of Ecuador. Fjords of Ecuador. Glaciers of Ecuador. Islands of Ecuador. Lakes of Ecuador. Mountains of Ecuador. Volcanoes in Ecuador. Rivers of Ecuador. Waterfalls of Ecuador. Valleys of Ecuador. World Heritage Sites in Ecuador. Regions of Ecuador. Ecoregions of Ecuador. Administrative divisions of Ecuador. Regions of Ecuador. Provinces of Ecuador. See also Province Cantons of Ecuador. See also Canton Parishes of Ecuador. See also Parish Municipalities of Ecuador. Provinces of Ecuador. Cantons of Ecuador. Parishes of Ecuador. Municipalities of Ecuador. Cities of Ecuador. Capital of Ecuador. Quito Province. Capitals of Ecuador. Demography of Ecuador. Nations of Ecuador. Ecuador is a plurinational state. In addition to whites, blacks, and mestizos, many Ecuadorians belong to indigenous nations, principally Achua, Awa, Chachi, Kofan, Epera, Wayuarani, Quechua, Manta, Secoya, Shwa, Siona, Sashila, Huancavilca, Zaparo. Government and politics of Ecuador. Politics of Ecuador. Form of government: presidential representative democratic republic. Capital of Ecuador: Quito. Elections in Ecuador. Liberalism and radicalism in Ecuador. Political parties in Ecuador. Branches of the government of Ecuador: executive branch of the government of Ecuador, head of state, president of Ecuador. Head of government, president of Ecuador, cabinet of Ecuador. Legislative branch of the government of Ecuador, National Congress of Ecuador. Ecuadorian Constituent Assembly. Judicial branch of the government of Ecuador, Supreme Court of Ecuador. Foreign relations of Ecuador, international organization membership. The Republic of Ecuador is a member of Law and Order in Ecuador, capital punishment in Ecuador, Constitution of Ecuador, crime in Ecuador, human rights in Ecuador, LGBT rights in Ecuador, freedom of religion in Ecuador, law enforcement in Ecuador, same-sex marriage in Ecuador, military of Ecuador, Commander-in-Chief, Ministry of Defense of Ecuador, Forces, Army of Ecuador, Navy of Ecuador, Air Force of Ecuador, Special Forces of Ecuador, military history of Ecuador, military ranks of Ecuador, history of Ecuador, timeline of the history of Ecuador, current events of Ecuador, military history of Ecuador, culture of Ecuador, architecture of Ecuador, cuisine of Ecuador, list of Ecuadorian dishes and foods, festivals in Ecuador, languages of Ecuador, media in Ecuador, national symbols of Ecuador, coat of arms of Ecuador, flag of Ecuador, national anthem of Ecuador, prostitution in Ecuador, public holidays in Ecuador, religion in Ecuador, Christianity in Ecuador, Hinduism in Ecuador, Islam in Ecuador, Judaism in Ecuador, Sikhism in Ecuador, World Heritage Sites in Ecuador, art in Ecuador, art in Ecuador, cinema of Ecuador, literature of Ecuador, music of Ecuador, television in Ecuador, theater in Ecuador, sports in Ecuador, Ecuador at the Olympics, football in Ecuador, science and technology, Ecuadorian Civilian Space Agency, economy and infrastructure of Ecuador, economic rank by nominal GDP, 68, EC Internet Country Code, top level domain for Ecuador, agriculture in Ecuador, Central Bank of Ecuador, communications in Ecuador, Internet in Ecuador, companies of Ecuador, currency of Ecuador, dollar ISO 4217 USD, energy in Ecuador, mining in Ecuador, oil industry in Ecuador, healthcare in Ecuador, Ecuador Stock Exchange, tourism in Ecuador, transport in Ecuador, airports in Ecuador, highways in Ecuador, rail transport in Ecuador, water supply and sanitation in Ecuador, education in Ecuador, health in Ecuador,